Okay, so this is just a quick formal introduction. Welcome everyone. This is a very personal initiative wherein we engage in spirited discussions and conversations. Today's speaker is, of course, many of us know, Dr. Yoganand. He is going to give us more or less like a lecture, if I may say so, on eco-criticism. More so to understand the mission of eco-criticism as a tool for intervening in a way how nature is constructed or how nature is imagined. Uh, uh, as much as we know it, most of us know that this is as a field in literary disciplines. The eco-criticism emerged as a field of study that tried to understand the relationship between literature and environment. We want to take it a little out of the literary field and to see if it has any scope of bringing in some changes in reality. So on this notion, we would like to hear what you have in store for us, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Not that I have too much in store, but anyway. See, originally when Suhasini called me up and asked me to speak about something, she also suggested that I speak about theory. But the problem with me speaking about theory is that I am tired of speaking about theory. I've spoken about theory so much, both in the class and outside and elsewhere in webinars and several conferences, that I begin to repeat myself and I'm boring myself. So I suggested if I could speak on eco-criticism, also one of the critical theories. That's why I asked, and then she said it would be better for me to have a text and then show how eco-criticism works. So I suggested that we could do it in two parts. I suggested that in the first part, and she also told me that there are quite a few who may not be initiated into eco-criticism, quite a few of them who may not know anything about eco-criticism. So doing both the things in the same session would be a little too heavy and also a little difficult. It wouldn't be very, very productive because it needs to be done in at least 2 or 3 steps. First, get to know what eco-criticism is, uh, then have a text, then read up the text, and then apply eco-critical principles or tenets. So this does take time. So I suggested that we do it in 2 sessions. Session 1 is very, very general today. The general in the sense that very basic stuff about eco-criticism, very, very elementary and very, very basic. Some of you have already done your PhD, MPhil, etc. in eco-criticism may find it very, very elementary. But then there are also people who may not be initiated into eco-criticism. So therefore, it becomes necessary on our part to get them updated with at least the basics. So this particular session is very, very elementary. We'll talk about eco-criticism, its origin, then how it went on to become a critical theory, and the different stages that eco-criticism went through, just like feminism or feminist literary criticism or feminism that went through quite a lot of phases, 3 or 4 phases or stages in its development. So also eco-criticism, that is what I thought I would share with you today. And in say maybe some session that we can have 15 days later, a fortnight later, we could analyze, I could analyze say Amitabh Ghosh's Hungry Tide and show how eco-criticism can be applied to the analysis of literary text. Well, that way you can apply literary criticism to, say, even for that matter, Avatar, the movie Avatar, several other texts, but I thought I would apply it to Amitabh Ghosh's Hungry Tide. So this is what I suggested to Suhasini, and if that is perfectly all right by you, we could do something like that. We could have a very elementary session today, just the introduction and things like that, and some terms that are used in eco-criticism. And then 15 days later, maybe today is what, 13th. So toward the end of this month, if we can have one more session where we will, that 15 days will be enough for us to read that novel. Some of us may have read that novel, and such of us who have not read that novel, we would give them enough time to read that novel. Since this is a small group, it's better that I suggest we do something as serious as that. Talking about eco-criticism in a very flippant manner and nothing coming out of it, that is just sheer waste of time. Rather than that, since this is a very small group, this is something that we can attempt, show how or see how eco-criticism works in practice. Because for me, the interest has not been just theory for theory's sake. For me, the interest has been theory in practice. Otherwise, theory is absolutely of no use at all. One could go on and on and on, talk about theory. That would just be spinning words and being very, very airy. Instead of that, if we take a text, then apply eco-critical principles and see how it is possible for us to analyze. Then how eco-criticism really works as what will be called as a reading strategy. Then that would be a little concrete, since it's a small group and only such people who are genuinely interested are the ones who will participate in these discussions. This is what I thought. So from that point of view, what I have to say today is very, very elementary, because this is supposed to take place in two sessions. The second session, if that is agreeable to you, maybe we can go ahead with that, because that I think is what is more useful. At least we will get to know what eco-criticism does, and also we will have some occasion to discuss certain very, very burning issues concerning conservation, concerning eco-criticism, concerning the environment, etc. So if that is all right, we could go ahead with that arrangement. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I think it's fine, sir.
Yeah.
I think
But one promise that I need from you is this, that you will finish reading Hungry Tide by the time that we have the second session, and not read Spark Notes.
yeah, I think that will be better. I think we are not students in that term, so I think everybody will have time to read the book rather than using.
Sir, I agree with you. I would like to be very, very optimistic, but then we may not be students, but it doesn't take much time for us to lapse into that state of being a student. And being a student means doing those things.
I think
ಗುರುಗಳೇ, ನಮ್ಗೆ ಒಬ್ರು ಕನ್ನಡ ಮೇಷ್ಟ್ರು ಇದ್ರು.
ಒಂದ್ಸಲ Shiva, please speak in English, so that there may be one or two who may not know Kannada. Please.
When we were in degree, we had one Kannada teacher, Sanna Hanmantaya anta, Chikan Mantaya anta. When he was taking classes for us, he was slightly disillusioned because not many of us were prepared for the classes with the texts. So some of us said, like, the text is not available. He said, you got to somehow buy or borrow or beg or at least steal andru. Do something, but be in possession of the text anta. So here, when you said, like, don't come to the session reading Spark Notes andrala, I would rather say at least that should be okay.
I think that is diluting it a little too much. Anyway, so on your screen you have one or two details that concern the origin of ecocriticism. The term ecocriticism, as some of you may already have been introduced to ecocriticism, would know, was a term that was used in a paper that a critic by name William Ruckert used in 1978. The term was almost dormant for quite some time. It did not seem to attract the attention of quite a lot of critics who should have been interested in it. Because if we take a look at the year, that year is also the same year as which Edward Said published his Orientalism. And we know in about 8-10 years what kind of institution Orientalism became and how it revolutionized English studies or literary studies or studies in humanities. So something like that did not happen with ecocriticism, though it should have caught the fancy of or the imagination of a lot of people. Somehow it did not seem to, till a young student was actually a postgraduate student. She used the term once again in a paper that she presented at World Literary Association conference in 1989. If you look at the gap, it's almost about 10-11 years. So it's very interesting to know why it is that it did not attract the attention of the academics or the students, when especially environment and issues related to environment had started becoming very, very prominent in discussions in political circles, especially at international conferences. So it's quite interesting to know why it did not become, why it did not attract the attention of quite a lot of people. Possibly it could be, in my opinion, it could be because they believe that since it involved borrowing concepts from ecology, which was very, very loaded with science, which was something that was listed under science. So people in humanities or people in English studies did not want, I think, to touch something that had a lot of science, so to say, in it. So that probably must have been the reason why it did not seem to attract the attention of the literary scholars or critics. Now, in 4 years later, after she presented that paper, she, along with her professor Harold Fromm, edited the landmark book. Even today, it is considered as a very, very important book insofar as ecocriticism is concerned. This will be there on every student of ecocriticism. This is there on the reading list of all ecocriticism courses all over the world, irrespective of the university in which it is offered. Well, India is a little late in catching up, as usual, in the sense that ecocriticism as a course is not offered in too many universities. It's only in a handful of universities in India that we find ecocriticism being offered. So, irrespective of the university, irrespective of the part of the world in which the university is located, on any given course of ecocriticism or concerning ecocriticism, this book is even today a regular item. This has remained, like as you can see, a very important reference book for students, academics, and scholars. Well, ecocriticism's emergence is obviously linked to the rise of environmentalism, because things like global warming, things like deforestation, See, something that began with industrial revolution, especially in the West, in a way started becoming very, very stark. And especially with the rise of capitalism after 1960s, it seemed as if environment was bearing the brunt. In a way, we could take a look at Eliot, for example, T.S. Eliot, for example, in the 1920s, 1930s, who talks about the fog over the London Bridge, and also a couple of poems of his, in which we see him talking about environment being degraded. But then the modernists, none of the modernists took it up or chased it. Possibly because for them, what mattered most for the modernists, of course, I won't talk about the romantics. That's something that all of us know. That would be stating the obvious. But then the question is, why is it that in a way the modernist period is also a period which was informed by environmental degradation? We see that in their images, in the images of their modernist writers. The Center Cannot Hold, for example, or Eliot, or Joyce, or Virginia Woolf. We do see Conrad, for example. We do see these things in there, even D.H. Lawrence for that matter, when he is talking about the mining and how mining is degrading the environment. So most of these modernists did address the issue of environmental degradation, but none of them chased it. None of them seemed to have her or his heart in what they were talking about, especially when it concerned environment. Though it appeared very, very consistently in their writing, though of course the kind of environment that they may be talking about was more urban than the idyllic, the pastoral, the idyllic kind of an environment that we get in the romantics, but they did not chase it. That was the problem with them. In a way, we can't. I would be overreaching myself if I were to say that was the problem with them, because that was not their interest. And for them to chase the environment would have been to go out of themselves, whereas there were people who were concerned with exploring the interiority. And one of the problems that the modernists had with the romantics was that they were the poets of, or they were the writers of, the explorers of the outside world. And the modernists were more interested in exploring the interiority. And that could be one reason why it did not seem, environment did not seem to be a very, very important issue for them. But in the 50s, 60s, when we see the 60s is what is generally seen as called as the golden age of capitalism. And with the rise in capitalism, we see environmental destruction increasing manifold. And that was also a time when people began to realize that the kind of damage that environment is being subjected to is something that must be addressed, and must be addressed on a war footing. So this was the backdrop. And also Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, in a way can be seen as generally seen as the founding text of modern environmentalism. One reason why it could be considered, or it has been considered as a very important text, the grounding text, the founding text, is because of the international exposure that it received. And some of you who may have read Silent Spring will know what exactly it is that I am talking about. Rachel Carson did not come from literary field. She was not associated with literature at all. On the other hand, she was some kind of a scientist, who uh, actually this one Keats line is what Rachel Carson used as the opener for her Silent Spring. I just quoted the same lines, the same line of Keats. And that was her basic interest. She wanted to know why the American bald eagle, which is America's national bird, also the symbol, why its population was depleting or dwindling. And when she started exploring, then she saw that the use of DDT, uh, subsequently, government of America banned the use of DDT. The use of DDT, the widespread use of DDT as a pesticide in farming practices and agricultural practices was the reason why the American eagle, the American bald eagle, the population of the eagle was dwindling. Now, when she published it, there was a lot of opposition, and we can imagine where this opposition came from. It basically came from the capitalists. It came from those people who manufactured these chemical pesticides. So in a way, this book got a lot of publicity, so to say. And probably that could have been the reason why it's considered as the founding text of environmentalism. Here, this is the book. Now, and why is it that literary scholars did not have a problem in accepting it? Because when you read that book, you will see that there are very, very definite literary devices used. For example, the book opens this way, the way that any fable or any fairy tale would begin. There once was a town in America where all life seemed to live in harmony with. See, the very, very way in which it opens. There was once a town, something like, say, once upon a time, something very, very similar to that. So since it relied very, very heavily on literary genres, like the pastoral, here you see in the very first line you have the idea of the pastoral. There was once a town in America where all seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. That is typically as pastoral as pastoral can get. So in a way, because this book used these kind of genres that are or styles or devices that students of literature are very, very familiar with, it uh, literary studies or students of literature immediately took a liking for this book, and that's how that book has become one of the most important texts in any eco-criticism course. Here, however, there is a contradiction in environmentalism. This is something that has been pointed out. Now, in a way, from one point of view, environmentalism is both a critique of industrial modernity and also a product of it. See, that is the contradiction. And I was talking to you about how industrial, the environmental degradation in America, in England had started with the Industrial Revolution. So in a way, it's not very difficult to see why environmentalism starts critiquing industrial modernity. But then how is it a product of modernity? Because for the simple reason that it makes use of the modern modes of analysis, which means, in other words, it makes use of scientific strategies and technologies to study ecological or environmental damage. So, for example, identifying chemical traces and modern forms of communication like TV to create awareness. So, in a way, you can see that it is both a critique of industrial modernity as well as a product of industrial modernity or modernity. So this is a contradiction that has been pointed out, and somehow this has not been resolved. But the question for us is it necessary for us to resolve this contradiction? Is it necessary for us to frame it in terms which appear to be contradictory? Because it is always very, very simple to understand that if you have an enemy who is powerful and has certain powers, it's necessary for you to counter that enemy making use of the same kind of powers that he or she uses. For example, James Bond. If you look at James Bond, you will see that he almost uses the same strategies or methods that the villain uses. The same kind of violence, the same kind of high-tech weapons, so to say. So if we look at it from that point of view, this does not seem to be a contradiction at all. And if it is framed as contradiction, I think that is a little carrying it a little too much. Well then, ecocriticism at times is also called as green studies. So in a way, before the term ecocriticism gained popularity, it's not as if that there was no engagement with ecocriticism or nature as it was represented in literary texts. This ecocriticism is something that came into being only in 1990s, as we can see. As a theory, it started getting a kind of form only in 1990s. But I remember very well in my own class, where did I go? I remember in my own class when one of my professors was teaching us certain texts, he would speak about what he called as bird poems. And he would get these poems that were written on birds, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, and quite a few, and then read to us, analyze that in the class. So in a way, it's not as if ecocriticism or nature as it was represented in literary text was not studied at all. It was studied at all, but it was not called ecocriticism. It's simply study of nature writing. That's how it was seen. Now, anyone who starts digging a little into ecocriticism and ecocritical practices will soon come across a term like green studies. Now, what we have to understand is this, that ecocriticism and green studies are national variants. In other words, American academics use the term ecocriticism, whereas the British academics use the term green studies. So more or less, they are the same, but there are very, very slight differences, as you can see. But these differences were noticeable only in the early phase of ecocriticism. In a way, American ecocriticism was celebratory in nature, in the sense that if you take a look at early studies in ecocriticism, Walden, basically Thoreau, and Emerson, you will see that how ecocriticism was practiced in the initial stages in America was as if it was celebratory in nature. But however, how ecocriticism or green studies was practiced in England was to see it as minatory, the term that Peter Barry uses, which basically means to warn about the environmental threats. That's how we read Wordsworth today, as minatory and not as celebratory. Though it seems to be celebratory, we don't read Wordsworth as celebratory at all. Now, in the last, after the first initial stage, we see that there is very, very little difference between ecocriticism and green studies. Now, before ecocriticism became institutionalized, like I was telling you here, we can see that there have been quite a lot of texts written in trying to establish the construction of what we call as nature, the environment, the relationship between human beings and environment. And we see that dating back to 1920s, in India, we have Rabindranath Tagore's collection of 3-4 essays called The Collective Creative Unity. And there's a very interesting essay in that book called The Religion of the Forest. And then in other parts of the world, Aldous Huxley, who published an essay called Wordsworth in the Tropics. Very interesting. Some of you may not have heard about this paper or this research article. It's very interesting to see what it is that Aldous Huxley is saying. He is simply saying if Wordsworth had been born in the tropics or in Africa, would he still be writing the same way about nature as he does? That's a question that he asks. And then Raymond Williams' Country and the City, published in 1973. So these are some of the most important works that were informed by environmentalist ideas, but then they were not called ecocriticism, so the term hadn't been used at the time that these kind of studies were carried out. But however, even when ecocriticism became institutionalized, by institutionalized I mean being offered as courses in universities, in colleges, these works that were written before the institutionalization of environmentalism or ecocriticism, we see these have become very, very important even today. Well, then ecocriticism as practice, it is both literary as well as cultural criticism, but from an eco-environmentalist perspective. Sometimes it's also called as eco-discourse. It's also, at times, it's also called as eco-discourse. And what is it that these critics do, that is eco-critics do? Basically, what they do is they read in terms of their environmentally harmful or helpful effects. You know, when they look at a text, they see what kind of a discourse that it is bringing to the fore, and the relationship, what kind of an idea is, what kind of a notion. See, nature in itself is constructed. It's not as if nature is given. Nature in itself, what we understand by nature, the notion of nature itself is a construction. So when eco-critics read text, this is what they look at. How does this text create, or what kind of a notion of nature does this text advocate? See, that's where the problem was, why eco-criticism did not become very, very popular. Because here what happens is one has to be aware of concepts in different disciplines. And we know very well that academics is very, very fussy about letting go of the kind of hold it has on the discipline. But today we talk about interdisciplinarity, but then more often than not, we would not like, for example, the English department to be merged with, say, humanities. But that is what interdisciplinary studies would mean. Now you can see why there was this resistance, because eco-criticism as a practice draws from a wide range of disciplines, ecology, philosophy, biology, sociology, etc. That was perhaps, like I said, the reason why it did not become very, very popular. But any eco-critic today, if she or he wishes to practice eco-criticism, then it would be necessary for him or her to be aware of or draw concepts, ideas from these different disciplines, So in a way, if there is one theory, any one theory which is truly multidisciplinary, not just interdisciplinary, but multidisciplinary, it is, I think, ecocriticism. Most literary theory that emerged after 1960s are interdisciplinary. But if there is any one literary theory that is multidisciplinary, then you can see that it is ecocriticism. Because after 60s, 70s, after the emergence of semiotics, the very notion of what constitutes a text has undergone a change. So therefore, it is perfectly possible for us to apply eco-critical principles to analyze or to interpret not just novels, books, fictional texts or non-fictional texts, but wide variety of other texts also, film texts, that is visuals, visual narratives, music, representation of urban spaces. Well, normally these are the kind of concepts that are typically used by eco-critics. You have the word ecology appearing very, very often. And as you know, ecology is the study of natural interdependencies. The idea is that every organism on Earth is in one way or the other related to another organism, however visible or invisible that organism might be. The study of this relationship is what's called as ecology. Then words like ecosystem. I know of a critic who has analyzed Keats' Ode to Autumn as an ecosystem. Well, these are terms that are used. Ecosystems are a set of local conditions that support life. Certain, we also sometimes use the word endemic in environmentalism, in conservation practices. We sometimes use the term endemic, which simply means that a particular species of plant or animal or insect is available or can be seen, its distribution can be seen in only one given place. There are quite a few invertebrates that have that are endemic, that are found in only one particular geographical location, nowhere else. You have, for example, the Malabar whistling thrush, which, of course, as it goes, this beautiful melodious songster is the thrush is something that you will find in quite a few locations. But this specific species called the Malabar whistling thrush is found only in the Western Ghats, nowhere else in the world. So we do have, that's what we mean by ecosystem. These are terms that eco-critics use very, very often. Then ecological niche, which is the combination of factors that makes the population of a particular species viable. Food chain. In a way, quite a lot of our policies, conservation policies, also derive from this concept of food chain. Some of us may know that in the mid 70s or maybe 1973 or 72, when the Project Tiger was launched, there was a lot of criticism as to why, when there were several other species that were endangered or critically endangered, why is it that tiger should receive all the attention, because the project was called Project Tiger. Now, why was tiger the flagship made the flagship species? Why was the thrust on the tiger? Now, in order to understand that, this food chain concept is what would help us understand, because the tiger, being a carnivore, sits at the top of the food chain. So the idea is this: if you wish to conserve or protect tiger, obviously its prey base has to be protected or conserved, and therefore the herbivores would automatically get conserved because they form the prey, they form the food for the carnivores, the tiger. Then if the food of the tiger is to be protected, then the prey's food had to be protected. That meant the plants, the grass, etc. Because you can get two kinds of herbivores. One are what are called as browsers. The others are what are called as grazers. Well, I'm sure you will know this. So you can see how the very idea of what constitutes food chain, the concept of food chain, the energy related issues. You see, basically, food chain is related to energy related issues. Because why is it that we need food? We need food because we need energy. And so from that point of view, it is possible for us to see some kind of hierarchy drawn up. So you have the predators or the carnivores sitting at the top, followed by the herbivores, and then the plants, etc., etc. So this was the explanation that was offered. Well, it is possible for us to deconstruct it. It is possible for us to become critical about it, because it arranges everything in terms of a hierarchical relationship, in hierarchical manner. So it's possible for us to be critical about it. But the point is, no matter how very critical we may be, the point is, see, this concept has played such a very important idea that several conservation policies have been based on this. That just was my point. Then you have the term Anthropocene being used. So you have the snow age, you have different kinds of geological ages, and the present one is supposed to be what's called as the Anthropocene, that is the human age. These are things that are used very, very often. Of course, there are also a lot of other terms that are used in ecocriticism, but these are some terms that you will come across very, very often. And then there are also different kinds of ecologists, surface ecologists and shallow ecologists. And these shallow ecologists are ecologists sometimes also called as green ecologists or light green ecologists. These are people who believe that with better use of technology and modern management practices, it is possible for us to conserve environment. On the other hand, the deep ecologists are just the opposite. They believe that technology is the problem, and it is technology that has degraded environment. It is technology that's responsible for this environmental uh, destruction. And so therefore, from their point of view, they simply say, stop using technology. Nature can, or environment knows how to take care of itself. I guess they have a point, because about 4 or 5 years ago, certain reports that came out from this Kudremukh region. I'm sure some of us are aware that Kudremukh Iron Ore Corporation Limited was at that point of time in the 70s, set up in 1970s, the Kudremukh region for the extraction of iron ore. Several 100,000 hectares of pristine Western Ghats were degraded because India wanted iron ore. So when this was after a lot of resistance from the environmentalists, closed down. It was a government of India undertaking. It was a public sector. So when it was closed down in 2000, it was closed down, formally closed down in 2000, because the environmentalists created such a lot of ruckus and fuss that the government was forced to close down this public sector. So that happened in 2000. And about 5-6 years after that, I have gone there, it was a very thriving kind of a township, very vibrant, very cosmopolitan kind of township. It was called the Kudremukh township. 6-7 years after it was shut down and people moved out of the township, it appears that tigers were spotted there. the reports say that the tigers were spotted there, which means, in other words, the deep ecologists or the dark green ecologists do have a point in the sense that you don't have to do anything at all. You just let nature be, let environment be, and environment can take care of itself. All that you have to do is don't intervene. So this is again another position that some ecologists take. And you also have another kind of ecologists called the social ecologists, who believe that the very idea of human domination over nature arises from the domination of human by human. In the sense that they say, as long as within the human society, the domination of one set of human beings or one group of human beings does not over another set of another group of human beings, whatever it be, in the name of gender, in the name of race, or in the name of caste, or whatever it be, unless that doesn't stop, domination over nature will continue. So these are the social ecologists. You have different kinds of ecologists, and any eco-critic must be familiar with these kind of positions that ecologists take, either the surface ecological position, light green ecologists, the dark green ecologists, or the social ecologists. Well, then, these are some of the attitudes to environment, chief among them being anthropocentrism, an attitude in which humanity is placed at the center of all life forms, which means, in other words, that everything that exists in the world exists for the benefit of human beings. In a way, whether it is possible for non-Western societies to be called anthropocentric, maybe in doubt, but there's very little doubt insofar as the Western societies being called anthropocentric, because it derives from the Bible. If we go back to Genesis, that is the book 1 of Old Testament, we notice that God takes 6 days to create the world, and then on the seventh day, on the sixth day, God creates Adam, and then says, and of course, along with Adam, you also see God creating Eve. And God tells Adam that this entire paradise, all that is there here, is yours. Use it the way you want. You enjoy. So please notice here that the emergence of anthropocentrism is as old as the Bible itself, because it is as if Bible itself is promoting that. That's a very, very important concept that eco-critics usually talk about. And then you also have biocentrism and ecocentrism, which is a mindset which places the non-human at the center, and has and it also is called as being earth-centered. On one hand, if anthropocentrism places human beings at the center, biocentrism or ecocentrism places non-human at the center. So that's another attitude. And generally, the deep ecologists adopt the biocentric or the ecocentric, the earth-centered approach. See, from their point of view, if you're using technology, it still means that you are intervening with nature, and somehow nature cannot take care of itself. Nature requires protection. So once again, even in the kind of idea that the surface ecologists, the shallow ecologists, the light green ecologists espouse, you can see that there is a kind of anthropocentric tinge to it, because they believe that earth cannot take, rather environment or nature cannot take care of itself, and therefore nature requires human intervention. So you can see it is as if human beings are protectors of nature, defenders of nature, protectors of nature. So in a way, of course, you can see that the echoes of that in post-colonialism, or even for that matter in feminist theories, you can see the echoes of this. Well, as I was talking to you about a little earlier, the different waves. As a theory, as you can see, as I was telling you, slowest to develop. Then ecology is a part of science. Ecocritics identify three distinct phases of waves in the development of ecocriticism. The first wave, this was the initial period when ecocriticism appeared on the horizon of literary studies. The representation of the world beyond. That means, in other words, the world of literary studies was coming out of the kind of influence that the new critics and the modernists had subjected literary criticism or literature to. So in a way, you can see now the movement is on the other side, the world beyond, the world outside human beings, the world outside human beings. The kind of questions that these critics asked of literary texts. How is nature represented in the sonnet, for example? Or what role does the physical setting play in the plot of this novel? How can we characterize nature writing as a genre? These are some of the questions that was interesting, or that interested the critics, the eco-critics of the first wave, which is the reason why you can see in the first wave, a lot of studies on Wordsworth, Emerson, Thoreau emerged. In other words, it is possible for us to see that in the works of Thoreau or Wordsworth or Emerson, or even for that matter, Walt Whitman for that matter, we can see that they are obviously about nature. So it's not as if you have to make an effort to see nature in their texts or to see environment in their texts. Their texts are about nature, their texts are about environment. So in a way, these texts are obviously about nature, about environment. However, this was what was attractive to the critics who came in this phase. And then in the second wave, we see that while the first phase of ecocriticism very consciously didn't engage with literary theory's insistence that everything is socially and linguistically constructed, the second wave reversed this. See, most literary theories are premised on one very, very important, what shall we say, position, that everything is constructed. There are two things. One is that which is biologically given, and the second is what is socially, historically, and linguistically constructed. Because the post-structuralists, and the post-structuralists were more engaged with the role that language played in the construction of notions, ideas, concepts, the reality itself. So the first wave of feminism, or rather first wave of eco-criticism, somehow did not subscribe to the idea that things were constructed, nature was constructed. It did not subscribe to that idea. But from second wave onwards, we see that this is reversed. In the initial stages, nature is not a construct. Nature is given. That is in the initial stages of eco-criticism. But when we move to the second, third waves of eco-criticism, we see that nature is seen as, or spoken of as, being constructed. And the argument here in the second wave was this, that the construction of nature is political, and that it was constructed and deployed in a way that reinforced certain dominant ideologies of gender, class, race. That's when Tempest was begun to Tempest, Shakespeare's Tempest, or Caliban, Prospero's attitude to Caliban, and how Caliban is always spoken of in terms of things that belong to nature, earth, etc. These kind of studies started emerging in the second phase or the second wave of eco-criticism. Well, then this shift is what led to the shift from first to second, is what led to the emergence of ecofeminism and post-colonial eco-criticism. We talk about post-colonial eco-criticism, we talk about ecofeminism. Both of them are, what shall we say, theories that emerged during eco-criticism's second wave. They did not emerge in the first wave. They emerged in the second wave. Then ecofeminism, well, I'm sure it's not necessary for me to talk about ecofeminism or post-colonial eco-criticism. Like I said, both of them were born in the second wave of eco-criticism. We can see here a very strong influence of social ecologist mode of thinking. What informs ecofeminism and post-colonial eco-criticism is the ideas of social ecologists. And ecofeminists point out that in most cultures, nature is constructed and identified as female. And ecofeminism identifies androcentric dualism. Anthropocentric is one, man versus nature. Ecofeminism starts talking about androcentric dualism, that is man, woman, and how that is manifest in the construction of nature. And these people, the ecofeminists, argue the manner in which nature is subordinated and degraded is the same way in which women have been subordinated and degraded. So therefore, ecofeminism and eco-criticism somewhere or the other come together. And that's why you don't have, I mean, there is no problem in having something like, say, ecofeminism. Then post-colonial and neo-colonial eco-criticism will explore the connection between ideological constructions of nature and exploitation of colonized people and their environments. Continuation of colonialist policies in new guises impacted eco-criticism, which led to reprisal of environmentalism. So critics point out that environmentalism of the rich, that is rich, of course, Ramchandra Guha comes readily to his mind, the rich nation environmentalism and environmentalism of the poor. Then the idea of environmental justice, and then environmental refugees, this begins to surface in the criticism of post-colonial eco-criticism. Then the third wave, see, all that is what we see in the second wave of eco-criticism. The third wave, this is said to have begun somewhere in 2009. The realization that ecological crises are not local, and which led to eco-cosmopolitanism, which transcends national boundaries. So of course, this is also based on Guattari and Deleuze's idea of deterritorialization. Basically, it means this, that if there is an ecological crisis in some part of the world, it's not as if only that part of the world will bear the brunt. The entire world will bear the brunt. Something like Corona, for example, COVID-19, for example, the virus. It may or may not have been accidentally released or deliberately released in China, but you can say that it has not spared any country. So in a way, if there is an ecological crisis, it's not as if only that particular, the effect will be localized. So we talk about global warming, terms like global warming. This seems to have become very, very current in the third wave of ecofeminism. So therefore, in the third wave of eco-criticism, we see a lot of climate-based studies. So if we talk about Amitabh Ghosh's non-fictional text, The Great Derangement, you can see that it comes somewhere in this period. So, and this third wave argues that global capitalism is what is responsible for the global ecological crisis. And the fourth wave, this is supposed to be the one that is current, and this is what has led to a post-humanist orientation. Well, post-humanism, I'm sure quite a lot of you already are aware what post-humanism means. Simply means that beyond a human. So you have robotics, you have a lot of these things that are outside a human. So these are what are called as the post-humanist orientations and studies. So if I were to say something like this, that human beings have become machines and machines have become human, then that's a typical post-humanist statement that I would be making. So in a way, this is a phase which has led to the tenets of deep ecology. So in what has happened in the fourth wave is this, that it has oriented towards the deep ecologist's position, that don't do anything to nature, don't pretend that you can protect nature. The technology is what the problem is. So in a way, it has also led to a lot of fiction called as cliffy climate fiction. You have different kinds of fiction, CP, cliffy. So cliffy is that kind of fiction which is based on climate change, etc. So that is a very rapid overview. Not, of course, much help, because this was only meant to be very, very elementary and just to give you an overview of ecocriticism. But like I said, the most meaningful thing would be for us to read the text and see how it works. The kind of issues that it is possible for us to unravel using ecocritical reading practice. And this was only some kind of a, what shall we say, window dresser, so to say. But that's why I suggested when she told me that it's only a small group and it's a very serious kind of a group. Otherwise, I wouldn't have offered to do take a text and analyze it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. I would have simply stopped with this. Simply stopped with what I have done now. So if you have any, of course, you may not have any questions, but if you would like to add, please go ahead and add to. It's possible that I may have left out something in my.
I just wanted to point out how language works. ಈ bird poems ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ. So here the word bird in fact is a very positive adjective. But if you use the same adjective to call somebody bird brain, it becomes offensive.
Not just that. Not just that. Yeah. As you call someone a stupid owl, you call someone. You see, you use a lot of. So the entire language itself is anthropocentric. Yeah. Right. Very language is anthropocentric.
So yeah. On a serious note, to get back to Rachel Carson's book, she has actually one very interesting chapter called Elixirs of Death. And she refers to all these chemicals that we are being exposed to. And one very interesting paradox that she points at is, we do all these things for our own protection, pesticides, insecticides, and these things in fact are being used in large quantities to ensure that the production actually gets increased. But what is interesting about the chemicals and the power of chemicals here is they penetrate the earth so much that they in fact even affect the water inside the earth. And the exposure to chemicals even from a distance of about half a kilometer could be dangerous and hazardous for our health. And she says most of these chemicals which are now being used by agriculturists actually were used for war purposes in the past. And now we are using all those chemicals for the sake of killing insects and pests, which ultimately will harm our own health. And this particular chapter is very interesting. She mentions about several chemicals, several. One of them is what you mentioned, DDT, and we in fact smell DDT even in our drinking water of late, and I mean all the time, and we think it will do us a lot of good. But unfortunate it is that all of us in fact have become so badly exposed to chemicals that there is no escape from chemicals anymore. All of us.
That's true. That's true.
This is one thing. And last point I want to add here is ecocriticism can be looked at from another very interesting viewpoint. Besides talking about the conservation of nature, there's a book called Eucalyptus by Murray Bale of Australia. He doesn't talk about preservation of eucalyptus. Instead, it's a very interesting book which talks about renegotiation of certain cultures in terms of exploring their nature, and nature becomes their identity, and eucalyptus becomes a beautiful identity for him. And when he is traveling in the air, he happens to locate eucalyptus being spread almost across the world, and he's upset about it because he thinks eucalyptus is purely the identity of Australian culture. So that way, ecocriticism actually becomes a very interesting domain for us to even negotiate our identities. And this actually becomes even more deep-rooted in the case of the Dalits. They actually use this ecocriticism to a large extent of late to renegotiate their identities, meaning the smell, the concept of the component of smell actually becomes part of their identities, which earlier was offensive for them. So there are n number of ways in which we can make use of this ecocriticism. So that way, your next session will be extremely interesting because we are going to read texts there.
Interestingly, Shibu,
here you gave us exposure to the fundamentals of ecocriticism, which I think should definitely initiate us into this. And yeah, wonderful it was.
no, very interestingly, just 3 days, 4 days ago, someone termed Government of India's attitude to northeastern states as environmental racism.
Oh wow.
Just 3-4 days ago.
Yeah.
So you can also have environmental racism, you see.
Correct.
Anyway, if there's anything else that anyone would like to, I mean, I don't see too many questions being asked here, but it's only a matter of adding.
Yeah.
Sorry?
That way, there are so many jokes about vegetarian people, vegans. In case there is both a vegetarian and a non-vegetarian sitting across a table, if they want to order for food, the vegan will order for maybe some kind of starters, and later the non-vegetarian will say, "Okay, we'll order for food also." So
That's not food for him or for them.
yeah.
Anybody else for further discussion? Everyone has.
Sure.
Yeah. So, bro.
Sure. Swasti ma'am had given us one text to read up before your session, sir. But other than that, I was also I came across this reading about Freed Corey, who has worked around green architecture. How architecture can be used in a way where if you are not focusing on how magnanimous and how grandeur your outlook of the architecture is, but how rather it's in its operational sense, how it's eco-friendly, how it is a better option in a world where the climate change is happening because there's not much focus on the operation. So what do you have to say about that kind of an architecture? Do you think it is a good solution, or are we again relying too much on the light ecologist's point of view?
In a way, you see, in an approach like that, the idea is that the human beings shouldn't become a burden to the environment. That's the idea. So take from environment as much as you need, but not more than what you need. That's the principle on which most of these people who for thousands of years lived in the forest along with nature, so to say. Their lifestyles, their livelihoods have always depended on the forest produce what is available, right? So in a way, they did not evolve into sophisticated economic societies that we evolved, that is growing crops in agriculture. You see, they still are pastoralists that way. They take what is there in nature. They only take as much as they need. So you can see that there is a similar kind of an idea here. So when you talk about green architecture, very little doubt that such of us who've been living in Bangalore, we know in the last 20-25 years, Bangalore's temperature, Bangalore's climate has changed terribly, and one of the reasons is the use of cement and steel. Look at the number of flyovers that are being constructed. Look at the amount of steel and cement that is being used, and obviously this will affect Bangalore's. This has affected Bangalore's climate. So, if it is possible for us to adopt certain eco-friendly architectural models, then that should, I suppose, mean that we become less of a burden to environment. Right.
And to add to Subhradeep's question, Gurugala, there's one interesting book called Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. It's a story of two architects. One architect, in fact, is quite inclined to constructing buildings which not only correspond to the surrounding environment, but it should also augment the beauty of the environment, so much that it should look more like the extension of its own environment. So you can definitely look at this particular work in the light of ecocriticism, because this particular architect very beautifully constructs all his buildings by giving more emphasis to what actually exists around the site of his construction. So that way you can look at this book in the light of ecocriticism. It's Ayn Rand's Fountainhead.
When I was a student, Ayn Rand was a rage.
Okay.
We the Living, and then Fountainhead. These were texts that you had to read if you had to sit in certain circles. That was in 80s, mid 80s. Anyway, yeah, that's right. And any course in architecture, you will see that one of the prescribed texts is Fountainhead.
Wow.
One of the texts is Fountainhead. They prescribe that text.
No, most readable. Yeah.
So another question is, I had asked ma'am in the previous session also, but I thought of asking it again because we also have you here, so I can have another perspective to it. So during this entire period of pandemics, do you think there have emerged new stories and new notions around animals? Like what I had asked in the previous session was, do you think like animals pitched against each other, like cows have taken the altar again as the pure and the purifying animal, and on the other hand we have bats who, with the species that's attacked so much, and they are stereotyped so much, like they were already stereotyped as the creatures of dark and fear and like in the Bengali culture, I can say for it that they were stereotyped as ominous, like the presence of bat in your house is a very ominous thing. So do you think such notions which were already existing, the present pandemic has given it a new push and has given rise to this new kind of paranoia about animals and against animals?
Whether that has happened or not, that needs to be seen. But one thing is very, very clear, that it's not the animals that have been infected with corona. It's the human beings that have been infected. If at all, if there is anything at all, for me, it shows how very vulnerable with human beings are with all their defense systems. By defense systems, I mean health-related defense systems. With all their sophisticated treatments, I mean medical advancements, it shows how still vulnerable we are. And animals don't seem to have any problem at all. And for the first time, I heard that corona being transmitted from a human being to a tiger or to a dog.
I was not aware of that.
In the initial stages when corona broke out, there was a zookeeper in America who was infected with coronavirus. And this lady was the caretaker of tiger in the zoo. And the tiger seemed to be infected through her, through contact with her. Just about another 3-4 days ago, there was a pet cat that seemed to be infected with corona, because the master, the person who owned that cat, suffered from or was tested corona positive, COVID positive. So if anything, it is now a total reassessment, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
It's a dent in the anthropocentrist side, so to say.
So maybe corona is the harbinger that humans need to understand that it's a requirement. Biocentrism is a requirement.
No, it's not a requirement. That's the only way that we can live in this world. Otherwise, there is absolutely no future for humankind.
So in your presentation, you had talked about, you mentioned this, how eco-criticism, it is so diverse in its viewpoint that it also looks into films and music representations. So when you were talking about that, I got reminded of films like Batman and Spider-Man, where we see the relationship between humans and the animal world again. However, this entire that, animals becoming the means for humans to become the superhuman, who are beyond the ordinary rules and norms of the ordinary citizens, and then becoming the superhero of the day. So what is your view on that, sir?
It's not very different from our goddesses and gods riding on the backs of animals. Is there? Not very different, isn't it? Huh? Durga is seen riding a tiger, and Ganesha is seen.
So Ganesha has like elephant face itself.
He's not riding the elephant. But anyway, it shouldn't matter. I mean, these things are things that are very, very, what shall we say, familiar to Indians, right? So if you look at Batman, or if you look at any of those characters that you're talking about, you can see that there are parallels. It's not as if for an Indian it is entirely new, right? So that idea is not entirely new. To the West, it might be new, but for us in India, it's not that very new. But it is possible for us to, it would be possible for us to do an eco-critical study of Batman and things like that. It would perfectly be possible. Absolutely no problem with that. You can do that. There is potential for that. You can do an eco-critical study and then see what so Manoj has a question. Most of the time, environmental policy makers play. Sorry, he asks this question. Most of the time, environmental policy makers pay significant attention to economic aspects in their analysis. Yes, they do. Absolutely, no doubt. So, what's the question, Manoj? I was not able to get the question. I think you're can't hear. Is it only me who cannot hear, or?
No, so
we can't.
So it might be an issue with your network, Manoj sir.
Yeah.
Manoj, you can type the remaining part of the question.
I think it's a little long one. So.
Right. In the meantime, sir, you did mention about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, of course. What was interesting was you mentioned the first few lines of the book, the opening of the book. You said that it more or less begins like a fable, like how a fable would begin. So how important is storytelling? Because I'm bringing our conversation back to literature, to trying to understand how theory in this particular discipline can be taken out and can somehow or the other trouble our mainstream thinking of how environment is depicted. So I'm just putting that question out here. This particular example that you gave, the opening lines of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, is more or less like a fable. How important is storytelling to environmental humanities?
See, if it has to be considered as an art, so it has to show certain features of art, right? See, otherwise it would simply be some kind of an essay that could be written, because it has, for example, Avatar the movie or Hungry Tide the novel. Now, if anything is to be discussed, it can be discussed in two ways. Very, very bland, in a very bland kind of a way, or make it an art, or transform it, or raise it to the level of art. Now, this is something that most writers do. Look at, for example, look at Girish Karnad's plays, for that matter. If you look at his plays, they are actually questions that may be called as civilizational questions. But please notice, he reformulates it in artistic terms. So any issue, any talk about environment, environmentalism, etc., environmental issues, when writers use it, what they do is they reformulate it in artistic terms. So from that point of view, storytelling does become important. Otherwise, it would simply be very, very bland kind of a prosaic kind of a discussion or an argument. That's exactly what Terry Eagleton talks about in his Marxist criticism. If you remember, he is talking about what is called as vulgar Marxism, where critics simply apply Marxist theory, the base and the superstructure, the notions of the concepts of base and superstructure, the analysis of any literary work or any artistic work. Now, what he goes on to say is, as you can see, that is what he calls is the mindless application of Marxist theories, which he calls as you are aware, vulgar Marxism, because he believes that art has a kind of autonomy, and that autonomy comes to it from the aesthetic aspect of art. So from that point of view, framing an argument in artistic terms, of course, will require, as you said, storytelling.
In fact, MHA also writes this somewhat similar about vulgar deconstruction. In one of his essays, the deconstructionist angel, he titles.
Abrams, M.H. Abrams.
M.H.
Yes.
Anyway, the entire idea of this session, because it's a closed group, was to understand what is eco-criticism, why is it important, and how is it possible for the non-literary faculty to take it out from the literary discipline and apply it in real life and alter our mainstream understanding or perspectives of how we look at environment. Of course, before I continue, Manoj sends his complete question. Question: the need of environmental policy is due to rampant economic activities, which is the main reason of ruining and destroying nature. Then why do these policy makers, that is the government, do not make strong policy?
On whose side do you think the government is? On whose side is the government? If we believe that the government is on the side of the marginalized, we are wrong. No, I'm not talking about just the government of India, but all over the world. You can see now when leaders, very powerful leaders, go to the extent of saying that there's no such thing called climate change, it's a hoax. You can see most right-wing leaders of the present day have at one point or the other made this statement that there is climate change is a hoax. Most and then coming from such very responsible leaders can very clearly tell you on what side the government is, irrespective of which government it is. We have our own Prime Minister saying that there is no such thing called climate change. It is just that we have become so very weak that we are intolerant. We are not able to tolerate the changes in temperature. When you have that, it's very obvious. And moreover, in a way, I would go with very, very classic Marxist opinion on this. See, what is the only source of wealth in this world? We're not talking about virtual world, right? Virtual wealth. We are talking about wealth, physical wealth in this world. The only source of physical wealth in this world is natural wealth, natural resources. So there's only one way by which you can become rich. That means you can become rich, only wealthy, only one way, and that is through exploiting or extracting or converting the natural wealth into consumable wealth. When that happens, you can see that that group which has gravitated or maneuvered into the center will knock off. Well, that is what the third wave and the fourth wave eco-criticism is addressing. The idea is that global capitalism is what is responsible for environmental destruction. So in a way, most governments these days all over the world are right-wing governments. See, a place like Sweden, suddenly we have disruptions in Sweden. You have right-wing groups, their right-wing group there causing destruction. So in a way, the idea is that the policymakers, so to say, the government itself is pro-capitalist. If it's pro-capitalist, there's only one way that it will formulate policies. So it would be a little too much to ask the policymakers, the government, to protect the environment. Because from their point of view, nothing wrong with environment, you are making it up. When they say God, there's no such thing called climate change, it's just a hoax, then what else are they trying to say? That there's nothing wrong with the environment. Why are you? There is also what is called as green terrorism, right? There's also that. But I don't believe that the governments of the present today will do anything to address these issues and environmental issues. They won't.
So maybe this because somewhere they need to redefine what development is, what civilization is. Because we still are somewhere or the other, or the ones who make up our policies, the ones who rule us in terms of democratic rule, if there's something called as that exists. Aren't they somewhere or the other still inclined towards what the colonizers left for us? So their understanding of civilization, modernism, and development is entirely different from the way we have, we have had our civilization.
That's true. But if you look at what is happening in India, today, what is so uniquely Indian about India? In a way, much of what we do is adopting the lifestyles, attitudes of the West. That's where the contradiction is. Right? On one hand, we want globalization. On one hand, we want the benefits of internationalization, globalization, privatization. On the other hand, we also want to say that no, India is unique and things like that. Nationalism. We want to protect our identity fiercely. On the other hand, we want all the benefits of globalization. That's where the contradiction is. So in a way, what is it that we can say this is uniquely Indian? Very little that we can say that this is uniquely Indian. So in a way, our thought processes have also changed. That is what is shocking most of the people, right?
In fact, Amitav Ghosh's The Climate, the Great Derangement, he begins with this line. He more or less tells that for industrialization to affect the large part of Asia, it took a lot of time. Even after industrial revolution happened in Europe, the major sectors of Europe, for it to have its domino effect on a larger part of Asia, it really took a lot of time. But then, yeah, now we are falling into that. It becomes a question, what is so unique about our country? And if you claim that, yes, there is something unique, we are in a position where we are unable to define or identify, yes, this is unique. Right? Yeah, it is a problematic situation.
So,
yeah.
So, because the discussion around this, what is so unique about this country is happening. So in this context, sir, do you think in the world, in the context of health, sir, because we have somewhere started defining terms and conditions for nature, that's why in the medicinal world, there is this conflict between Ayurveda and the Western medical science. And because of that, even Ayurveda today, we see it's commercialized to an extreme where once which was so affordable, which was so naturally present around us, today it's present within few pockets. So any comments on that?
Well, people know how to market. And one, you see, that is what capitalism thrives on. Capitalism thrives on its ability to sell. right? It will sell you what you don't want. Look at these metros, and also look at the practice in metros where you can buy not just one unit of it. If you have to buy, you have to buy a minimum of 3. Well, what is that? It's a typical capitalist strategy, isn't it? Selling you more than what you actually need.
So then, do you think the ecological view towards medicine, towards science, has been marketed and has actually lost, or rather failed in its uh, intended action of making an awareness about nature and making an awareness that the gifts of nature are present, but you're depleting it by using your science. You need to return to it. You can use the resources in a better fashion, but on the other hand, it has been marketed in a way that use it in a better fashion and in a profitable manner.
That's what I was trying to say. What is so unique about this country? What was unique about this country was the mindset, the relationship that this country had with environment, and that relationship had a spiritual basis, right? If you happen to read that essay or that book by Tagore, Creative Unity, you will see that he is constructing a relationship between human beings and nature on spiritual terms. Now that was what was unique about India. Now, people who had thousands of years of spiritual history, how is it that in a matter of 100 years or 40, 50 years, we've suddenly abandoned the spiritualism and become so very materialistic? See, we are putting even Americans and the Europeans to shame insofar as the materialist mindsets are concerned. Even Americans are not as materialists, though materialism comes to us from the West. Even Americans are not as materialist as we are. How is it that the thousands of years of spiritual history, the spirituality that was embedded in our DNAs, how is it that suddenly we erased it? This is what quite a lot of people find it very difficult to digest or even to understand, how thousands of years history can simply vanish and appear as if it has no impact on us. So what relationship that you are talking about, the Ayurveda and things like that, belongs to that world, that mindset. Now, Baba Ramdev, who promises or who claims to use Ayurveda, etc., etc., he is one of the top businessmen in India. See, that's what that's how it is possible for us to say that these are just symbols that are being used. These are being marketed, right? These are being marketed. So once again, this marketing idea of marketing comes from West. So the kind of strategies that we are developing is typically West, isn't it? So that's why I said, what is so unique about India? So what was unique about India has now disappeared. One second.
So you're muted.
Yeah, you continue with your discussion. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Yes. Right. Shivrudeep, you have anything else to ask?
No, sir. No, ma'am. I was just looking at Sir's library, and I just recalled that so many of us in a CCTS class, we had told Sir that, Sir, at the end of this semester, we are coming over to your place for lunch of books.
Okay, but I had something to add on to your
Yes, ma'am.
returning to Ayurveda or the
Yeah.
conflict between Ayurveda and the English medicine.
Ma'am, with that, if you can also add a comment on the Batman and Spider-Man question that I had asked, considering the fact that you're very much into them.
Yeah, one by one.
Yes, ma'am.
With this conflict about Ayurveda and the English medicine, for time being, I'm referring it to as the English medicine, not really representing the British alone, of course, the entire West. Right? Somewhere you also need to see marketing as part of capitalism is set out on, what do you say, small term goals, small term gains, which is the reason today most of our, if you see some of the most relevant books emerging in the field of literary theories or cultural studies, the one of the major books is the critique on capitalism. And I forgot the name of one recent book that I was reading. It's about understanding capitalism, and there the writer says one way of how capitalism or how we can get rid of capitalism is that capitalism defeat itself, and that is the only possible way.
That is what Marx says. That is a typical.
Brings in the term of alienation, sir.
Correct, ma. Marx, in his critique of capitalism, says capitalism will grow so fat, will be fed so much, and will grow so fat that it will not be able to sustain its own weight and will collapse. This is typical Marxist view. But what we see is this, that the capitalists, more capitalists have read Marx than socialists or Marxists. Very few Marxists and socialists have read Marx. More capitalists have read Marx.
Yeah.
So is it like that war strategy, that know your enemy strategy better than your own strategy? It's something of that sort.
Keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer.
Yes, Chanakya. Yes.
Marx's study of capitalism was so very accurate that the capitalists themselves did not understand. And so they understood capitalism through Marx. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. I was just mentioning about a particular book. I just left that in the chat box. It's called Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy by Joseph Schumpeter. It is in that he says capitalism does not easily disappear. It has to, as Sir said, it has to grow fat and it will eventually collapse. That's only way.
See, the point is capitalism is postponing it.
Yeah.
And it has been very successful. It has very successfully postponed, and it looks as if it has postponed it indefinitely. It's collapsed indefinitely. That is something that we can see.
Is there anything else that anybody else has anything to add to this discussion? I should think about your question on the Batman and Spider-Man and all of them. There's something called as Disneyfication as well.
Yeah. Well, is it something around the simulation and simulacra that Baudrillard discusses? The creation of a kind of a reality?
Reification. It's called reification. Well, yes, Baudrillard does talk about Disneyland, etc. in his simulation and simulacra. Let's talk about it. Yes.
I remember, sir, you had mentioned in one of your classes. After that, I read that essay. I reread that essay, and I was like, okay, my entire Disney childhood is lost.
Sorry for having done that.
No, sir, it's okay. You made me mature.
It is one way, of course, through theory, again, through concepts such as these. It is one of those ways in which we are trying to reorient our perspectives. It's not that we were wrong earlier and now we are getting into the right track. We are rather becoming more inclusive of other perspectives. And at the same time, we are being more or less like, what do you say, if I may use the word, taught which of these perspectives sustains better. And when you go back to understanding these, what do you say, representation of Batman and Spider-Man on a very, very crude level, you see that a human alone cannot save the world, so to say. Though you anti-hero, or anti-hero, however you want to it's in that notion that Batman came about. Who's the first one before Batman? Phantom.
Yes, ma'am. The Phantom.
Yeah, these dark heroes came about trying to save the world. Notice that these humans alone, as with their just humanly qualities, could not save the world. They had to more or less take help of animals, birds, whatever it is. Batman or Spider-Man becomes once he's bitten by the spider, he gets that radioactive powers, and eventually he becomes Spider-Man. In a crude way of understanding, yes, humans alone are still powerless.
Ma'am, but on that note, if I may there's just another question that just struck me, ma'am. If we look at the trajectory of Marvel, if we just take that industry, ma'am, from Batman to Spider-Man, where there's an influence of animals making a role in making the human superhuman, man. We have then Hulk and Captain America and Iron Man who are relying on science, scientific invention, technology. So do you think, ma'am, that somewhere humans, to satisfy their own human ego, they made this shift that, we don't need the animal world. We have enough science to make us superhuman and again save the entire world, which includes the animal world, man. Because if you see the last movie, the final battle of Marvel, I think, Endgame. So, ma'am, in that we see the region of Wakanda, ma'am, that came in crisis. But after the Endgame, the final movie that came about, ma'am, we see that it was the scientific knowledge of Doctor Strange that saved the entire globe, the natural world and the human world and everything. So do you think it's like even in industry they realized this and they shifted back to their human ego again?
One way of treating that would be understanding the fourth phase of industrial revolution, which we are presently facing, wherein we have made use of immense, technology, and we are artificial intelligence, what we call. We are in, industrial revolution 4.0 or something. That's how it is referred to right now. One way of understanding Marvel's The Endgame could be through that. The other way is perhaps somewhere or the other, some of these, at times, some of these mainstream entertainment, may it be in terms of movies, may it be in terms of music, may it be in terms of books, may it be in terms of poems, may it be in terms of any form of art. They try to take away the complete attention to something else, divert attention. At least for some period of time, we will not be arguing about, okay, save the environment, save the tiger, save the planet. And please notice this entire journey from DC Comics to Marvel itself. We started buying more and more of Batman merchandise, not just Batman, of course. We have all these superhero merchandise. Isn't somewhere or the other markets thriving on what we really, Aren't they manipulating us to?
That's typical capitalism, isn't it? Everything becomes a brand.
Yeah. For this reason, I really admire Bill Watterson. He never gave his permission to, make merchandise of Calvin and Hobbes. I'm sure most of you are aware of the comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes. Yes, Shukradeep. Okay.
Am I the only one with questions here? Like, I feel like being the youngest, I'm also so illiterate about so many things.
Like, that's why I'm saying
we like discussing. I mean, as I had mentioned to sir also, there's a small group, a serious group, who want to take these discussions forward.
But Subro, because you are the youngest, let me also tell you, if you
Yes,
believe
sir.
that we have, because we are older than you and we have all the answers, you are mistaken.
Yeah, true.
I remember, so you have mentioned that in a lot of class that you never have answers to everything.
At least I don't have answers to everything. Anyway, so can we do this? That 15 days later we come back and try to discuss Hungry Tide? Can we do that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a small group. I think everyone is okay with this. The Hungry Tide by Amitabh Ghosh. If you cannot get hold of the text, please do text me or send me an email. I may somehow source.
I'm not
Ma'am, will I get it on archive.org?
Perhaps you may. You may. So I will talk it out with sir and fix the next date, because apparently 27th was something that was there in my mind, 27th of this month. But then KSET is happening on that day. So I'm sure some of my other friends would be preparing for the exam, so I don't want to disturb them. Meanwhile, you will have enough time to read the entire book, The Hungry Tide. I will let you know about the next session through email or through my Instagram post. I don't think so that should be a problem. Right? Anyways, coming back to the entire creation of this particular session was to to have an understanding, a thorough understanding of ecocriticism for the ones who are already into reading ecocriticism. Another for those non-literary faculty as well, to give a glimpse of what exactly ecocriticism is and how to a little later can we take it out of that sacred discipline of literature and apply in our real life, in reality, so to say. Yes, this perhaps could be further concretized when we start looking at how this particular theory can be applied, can be seen in its application, which will be the entire focus in the next session. Yes, about the date and the timings, I will let you know. Perhaps this is because this is a second session and none of the Sundays are available. Each one is busy with something. It will be most definitely on a weekday, working day, in evening, for your convenience, in the evening. I hope that's fine with you all. Yeah?
That should be all
Yes,
right.
ma'am.
I mean, that's
Because
all right.
Jain University is planning now
Okay.
if
All right with me.
Okay. So, on that note, thank you so much, sir. I'm sorry to have disturbed you from your sleep.
I forgot actually. I
It's
was
okay.
doing something in the morning. I mean, and suddenly it slipped out of my mind. I'm very sorry to have held you up for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Very sorry.
That's perfectly all right. Anyway, we are just having a small conversation. It's as I told, a very small group. So I look forward to your second session as well and further spirited discussions and engagement.
Sure.
This, thank you so much for participating here. Please do attend the next session, having read The Hungry Tide. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good
Thank
evening.
you, sir.
Bye.
Bye.